Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Precious Mnkandla. I hail from Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. That's where I grew up. I've come today to tell a bit of a story about myself, and also I'm embarking on a journey of finding my biological mother. So I've come today just to have a bit of a talk on my brother's show, Prosper Moya's show, just to try and see if we can use social media as a tool. I've seen how good it's been for other people in trying to locate long lost relatives, long lost family. So I've decided to come today and see if this can work for me as well. I have been on this journey for quite some time, but it's been fruitless before. So this is my prayer today, that at least someone who will watch this will get an idea, or maybe may know the family, or maybe may know where my mother is, and help me by reaching out. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself with the hope that you'll get to know. As I said, my name is Precious Mnkandla. I was born in Johannesburg, South Africa. It's known as the Gauteng province. I believe I was born in Hillbrow, in Johannesburg. To my father and my mother at the time. My father is of Zimbabwean descent. So my belief is he had moved to South Africa around the 80s. He must have met my mother around 82, 83 in Johannesburg. And I came about, I believe I was born between 1987 and 1988. To my father's name was, is Lawrence Mnkandla. Hailing from Philabusi in Zimbabwe. So he had moved to South Africa. That's how he got to meet my mother. From my understanding, they never got married. They were just together as boyfriend and girlfriend at the time, when my mother came to fall pregnant with me. They must have been together for a couple of years, because going back, asking these questions to my father, he explained to me and said he had no idea where she came from in terms of the original place, but he knew that she was Xhosa by birth, and she had not come from the Gauteng province, but had come from somewhere in the Eastern Cape. He did not want to delve, or he did not delve as much into how things came about for them to separate, but in my understanding, it was irreconcilable differences. So my belief is my mother left just before I turned 2 years old. They'd been living together in downtown Johannesburg, Hillbrow. From my father's explanations, she had a couple of names that she was using when she was working in South Africa, of which he says he'd tried to make his own steps in trying to find her. However, it was fruitless. The search was fruitless. So as I grew up, I started to have these questions. I started to ask around, ask family if they knew where my mother originated from or where she had gone to. However, it proved so hard for me to get the answers that I needed, hence why I am here today. So going back, I was born 1987, 1988. When just before I was 2, my mother and my father separated whilst in Johannesburg. My father was a tradesman, so he worked all over South Africa, so he would be working up and down. So it proved so hard for him to look after me at that time. I must have stayed with him, from my understanding, for a year or so. He tried to remarry at that time, because I remember for quite a few months, I remember a mum, a stepmother at that time, who stayed with us for a while before I was collected by my paternal family and moved to Zimbabwe. So for me to come about, to end up being in Zimbabwe, my grandmother was alive at the time, and they stayed in a place called Nkulumane, Kosekusile, in Bulawayo, and that's in Zimbabwe. So there came about a plan that, okay, my father is working quite a lot. There didn't seem to be any stability for me at the time. So I think that's when my paternal, one of my aunts, the oldest aunt, traveled all the way from Zimbabwe to Johannesburg, where we were, collected me and then took me to Zimbabwe. That's how I ended up with staying with my grandmother in Nkulumane. I believe I went home to Zimbabwe between my 3rd and 4th birthday, still quite young, which would have meant I started school properly when I was in Zimbabwe. In South Africa, briefly, between the ages of 2 and 3, I believe I was in some sort of a creche, preschool, nursery type, where my father had signed me on. So sometimes I remember my father would take me there, or my stepmother would take me there. I would not remember the locations exactly, but I remember the creche was somewhere within Hillbrow. And me saying that, I have a vivid memory when I was at preschool. The preschool seemed to be located close to Brenda Fassie, the artist's, I don't know whether it was a studio or it was her living quarters, but I remember there was a few times when we would be playing out in the playground, and she would come out of these patio doors and she would be out on the veranda of some sort, playing and singing, and people would be, I remember us singing along as well and watching. So that was around those times. I must have gone to that preschool for probably 6 months to a year before I moved to Zimbabwe. And that was about the time where I would say that was the last really proper time I spent around my father. After that, I moved to Zimbabwe. I stayed with my grandmother. She took care of me. She, looked after me from what to eat, what to put on, clothes to put on, school. So I remember she sought out a place for me for grade 1. This was at Amavene Primary School in Nkulumane. So I did my primary education there up until grade 6. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away. She was quite unwell for some time, and she passed away in 1999. So from that time, that's when I was moved and I stayed with my paternal aunt, who was older than my father at the time. I also got time to sometimes visit other family members. So my father has got brothers and sisters, all in Zimbabwe, and most of them were quite involved. The family was quite involved in my upbringing quite a lot. There were times we would try to locate my father in South Africa, but it proved difficult at times because he was someone who worked up and down the country. There came a time when I was growing up, grandmothers, they keep artifacts, they keep little, memoirs over time. And one of the biggest things that I would always be thankful for my grandmother is that she kept this album that had almost all the pictures of when I was growing up, when I was still a baby. But within that album, there were pictures of my dad in different locations where we lived in South Africa. But also what struck me is there were pictures of a woman there who seemed to be around my father around the time before I was born and when I was born. And what struck me so much is she looked so much like me. And this is me noticing this. This is after my grandmother had passed on. So this album had been left in the possession of my aunt. My grandmother had left that album in the blanket and some paperwork that was left behind. So I remember one time I stumbled onto this album. This was at my aunt's house, and inside there were birth certificates, some birth documents and stuff. And I remember seeing a birth card in there. It had my name, had a mother's name in there, but at that time it didn't seem to make sense to me. However, what struck me was the pictures in the album. So that's when I took this album. I remember going over to my aunt. This was after, I think I was around grade 7. And I remember asking her and saying, "Who is this woman? Do you have an idea who she is? Could she be my mom? Because she looks so much like me." I remember I was looking at my mother's picture, and all her pictures where she was smiling, she was showing a diastema. And I've got the same. So I was saying she looks so much like me. And it was the look on my aunt's face that almost said something like, "I wish I could tell you more, but I can't." Maybe because she didn't know what to say, or she didn't have the information. However, being a child, also at that time, I didn't know how to handle it and what questions to ask. So I think that sort of got brushed off. But what I did, I held on to that album and I never let it go. And it always played in my head that one day the best person I would have to ask is my father, because that's what my aunt had said. She said, there will be a time when we contact your father and get through to him, we'll ask him, where is this woman and who she is? Unfortunately, years went by. I moved over to the UK after my education. So primary schooling, like I said, I went to Amaveni Primary School in Kulumane. Then after my grandmother passed on, grade 6, grade 7, I moved to Kwanda. That's where my aunt, my oldest paternal aunt, was staying at the time at a police camp. And I went to Mount Kazelet Primary School in Kwanda to do my grade 7. And then did my Form 1 at Kwanda High School. That was the first and the second term. Finances were not so great at the time, but the family tried to pull resources together to make sure that I could get an education. Those times it was difficult getting hold of my father or him to be fully involved in my upbringing. However, the family tried. So I did my Form 1, Form 2, Kwanda High School, and then my Form 1, third term, up until Form 4, that's when they took me and signed me up to boarding school in Mat South. It's called Jason Ziapapa Moyo High School in West Nicholson. So that's where I did my Form 1 to Form 4. That's where I finished my education in Zimbabwe. And then I moved over to the UK to join a guardian aunt of mine who'd taken over the affairs of paying for my school fees, looking after me. And at that time, she was already working in the UK, so she managed to get me over to the UK. This is the youngest aunt in the family. After moving over to the UK, I'd say beforehand they tried to get in touch with my father, and it was a bit difficult. However, I managed to get in touch after I'd moved on. One of the reasons, big reasons, was I'd started again asking those questions to my aunt. And I remember her turning around and saying, you know, we could ask your father. He's the one who would have all the answers. Us as a family, we didn't get the chance, unfortunately, to meet your mom, but at least we had the chance to meet you, and you are here. And now that you are grown and you're mature enough, have that conversation with your father. He will know what to say. I remember making that phone call for the first time. It was quite daunting. I mean, remember, we had been on and off in touch, mostly off touch, out of touch. So it's one of those difficult conversations you can never have with someone. So I remember asking for the first time, it didn't go so well. My father could not give me the answers that I wanted at the time and I was expecting at the time. And I must say, I was also a bit, emotional at the time. So a lot was said. But I did manage to get a bit of information out of there. He mentioned that she was of Xhosa origin. She was not from around Johannesburg. When they met, she was someone who had come from home, which was in the Eastern Cape. However, he didn't know whereabouts in the Eastern Cape she came from. So I had a lot of questions still because I was asking. You can't tell me you don't know the name. You don't know her birth date. You don't know whether she's got sisters, whether she's got brothers, whether she's got, And I had all these questions. You came about, you had me. How, when you don't know all these things? So that was a bit too much. And our communication sort of stopped for a while with my father. Years went by. I think I sort of put it in the back burner at the back of my mind and said, you know what, let me get on with my education. As long as I've got family, I'm fine. But as you grow up, questions will keep coming up, especially at the back of your head. You see some situations, it's difficult as a girl child growing up. You see so much. You see other girls, other families, other people mentioning their mothers, other people mentioning their families. And and you ask yourself, okay, do I have a mother out there? Could she also be looking for me? And one of my other biggest questions was, do I have siblings out there? Because as much as I grew up around cousins, cousin sisters, cousin brothers. That sort of covered the void for me. However, the more I grew up, I saw that they had their siblings. They had their moms and dads. And that would always come back at the back of my mind, like, you need to know where your mom is. So that never left me. I remember one time trying to sign up to Ancestry.com, and because you have to pay a fee, I just thought, forget it. And then I once tried to reach out to Kumbulekaya, one of my cousins in South Africa. My aunt's eldest daughter was saying, I've seen a lot of people finding their loved ones, finding their long-lost relatives on these shows. It works. Why don't you try TV shows? But that seemed too much of legwork for me to do, considering I'm in the United Kingdom and this is miles and miles away in South Africa. And where would I begin still? I tried to engage some members of the family who are in South Africa on the ground, but sometimes with financial restraints, it would prove so hard, and then I would always put it off. Then there came a time where I became a mother myself, and those questions started coming back again. And I was saying to myself, how would it feel if my mother knew that I've got a child? Or how would it feel if my son woke up and I wasn't there? And that struck me. So I decided, okay, it's now or never. Let me try and re-engage with people, try and look for my mom again. It's been quite emotional because I feel like I've been hitting against a wall with everywhere I've turned, and mainly because I think it's the lack of information, and because I'm not on the ground myself. I've tried because mostly my biggest obstacle is the names, because there's about 3 names that are at play which my mother may have used around that time. And another thing is, although I've got an album with pictures which I've tried to put out in social media, it's knowing the location where she could be. In this search of mine, I've come to peace. I've made peace with the fact that, one, maybe she could no longer be here, but I still want to look for her, even if she won't be on this earth anymore. Just knowing where she came from, where her family could be. Maybe I've got uncles and aunts out there, maybe siblings as well. So this search is not only for me, but also for my son, and also for the other side of the family as well, to know that there's someone like me out here, and I'm really longing to know my maternal family. You know, there's nothing that is so painful like not really knowing where you come from, where your other part comes from. as Africans, we are made by our paternal side and our maternal side. Our maternal side more so because that's where mama comes from. That's where we originate from. So I'm just trying to fill that void as well. Yeah, so this is my story. If maybe anyone out there who may have some information, I can give you the names, my mother's names, and where she could have come from. I managed to dig a bit more with my dad. That's how he managed to give me some names. And also in terms of where she comes from. So whoever may be out there, maybe they may push the word forward, share the word, spread the word, so that maybe members of the family will find out. I just wanted to share a bit more about my mother. Maybe someone out there may know about her or her family members, or just spread the word if you can. She's of Xhosa origin. Her names, so she would have been using Ntombizodwa Khumalo, or whilst in South Africa, in Johannesburg, she may have used Nomsa Hadebe or Elizabeth van Wyk, but what I believe she may have been using Ntombizodwa Khumalo back home. Her hometown is Queenstown in East London. That's in the Eastern Cape, Cape Province of South Africa. So if anyone in those areas may know, she's of Xhosa origin. She may look like me. I've got some pictures. The biggest thing is that we share a diastema. So yeah, if anyone may know a young lady or a lady who may look like me, by those names coming from those areas, please reach out. There will be some information in this video. Thank you.